let's paint the picture of what autonomy really means. One of my favorite stories it's actually from an A-level sports psychology textbook. So imagine Bob, who's in his retirement years, and he loves watching daytime TV, absolutely loves it. And he's sitting there and he's living in a cul-de-sac area in the suburbs, and he's got a few neighbors, and he's got this beautiful patch of grass outside of his house. And there's three little children that have just moved in next door, and they are obsessed with football, absolutely obsessed with it. But they don't really have a very good space. Their garden's a bit of a mess. And they love playing football on Bob's garden. And they use the big brick wall of his house as the goal. So he sits there trying to watch his daytime TV. And these three little kids spend hours on hours kicking this ball, tearing up his garden, smashing it into the wall, and really disturbing him. But Bob knows a thing or two about psychology. And after a few days of getting pretty frustrated and asking them to leave, and they just won't leave, he decides he's going to play a trick on them. So he goes out there one day and he says, lads, I've been watching you play, and I'm not going to lie to you. Wow, absolutely incredible. I'm so impressed with what I've seen. And it was sort of coming to the end of the day, and he knew that they were about to go home. It was about 6 o'clock in the evening for their dinner with the family. And he said, just before you go, I want to give you guys $5 each for your performance today, because wow, the performances were just absolutely astonishing. So here you go, well done. And he gave them each $5 each for their performance. Anyway, of course, they were just absolutely made up, couldn't believe their luck. Of course, they came back the next day, ball down on the grass, tearing it up, kicking it up against the wall for hours, causing mayhem. And I've just had a note that around audio, so it sounds like it's working for most people. So anyway, the kids come back onto the field, and there they are playing football and having a whale of a time. And he waits to the end of the day, and decides that he goes out there and says, guys, again, I've been watching you play, unbelievable performances. Do you know what? I don't have as much money on me today. I've only got $4 each for you, but still brilliant. The kids are pretty pumped. They're pretty excited, just been paid to play football. Anyway, of course, they come back the next day and carry on playing. But each day they come back, he keeps reducing the amount of money to the point where on the last day, boys, I've been watching you play. Unbelievable. I'm really sorry. I've got absolutely nothing to give you. And the kids are absolutely furious. And they say, do you know what? We are never coming back to play football on your garden again. And Bob had won. And what Bob had managed to do is he'd managed to change the reason why they were there. Where previously they were there for internal reasons, that intrinsic motivation, he had changed that, what we call locus of control, to an external reason. And he had decided to reward them with some financial incentives to play football. So now they were doing it for the money. And then the moment he took that external reason away, he'd undermined their intrinsic motivation. And now all of a sudden they had lost the enjoyment of playing just for the sake of playing. So Bob knew a thing or two about the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. There's a lot of people that may have heard of this idea before, and definitely if you've done the coach training program, you will have heard about this. But what I'm going to do today is I'm just going to take it into a deeper level for you. So, because there's actually some nuance between being externally motivated, doing it just for the reward, and intrinsically motivated, doing it just for the love of the activity. So what's external motivation? External motivation is doing something just for the sake of the reward or the threat of a punishment. So that carrot and stick idea. It's the least effective motivator, particularly for certain situations. And I'll talk about those in a minute. So it's the weakest form of motivation, when we're motivated just because we want to get an immediate reward or avoid the threat of an immediate punishment. But there's a few more gaps, but there's a few more stages between external motivation and intrinsic motivation. Introjected motivation, now we've moved a bit further up the continuum, and we're getting a little bit closer to intrinsic motivation. Introjected motivation is you're doing something not because of the fear of a threat or an immediate reward, but maybe because you want to avoid some sort of shame, or you're trying to gain the approval of others. You might have been inspired by somebody that you've just met, and you might want to try and improve them or impress them or win their approval. So you might suddenly have a burst of motivation. That's what we call introjected motivation. But we can still move up, getting a little bit closer to that intrinsic motivation. We have something called identified motivation. We're still not doing it because of that deep satisfaction, that deep feeling of reward that we get just from the activity itself. But we do recognize that there's a value in doing it. So we might have just started going to the gym. We know that it's good for us. We're not really enjoying it, but we know that there's value in it in the long term. So we persist because we've identified it as an important piece. So that's what we call identified motivation. And then all of those are still extrinsic. They still have that weakness factor of being extrinsic motivators. Of course, the holy grail of motivation, according to this theory, is this idea of intrinsic motivation. We're doing it for the deep satisfaction and enjoyment of the activity itself. And that's where those little boys were when they were playing football. They just loved that feeling of kicking the ball, the feeling of striking it beautifully, and that fun they were having when they were playing. That's why they were really doing it. And that's when our motivation is intrinsic. But there's a couple of other pieces that are probably worth pointing out here, is the difference between controlled motivation and autonomous motivation. So identified motivation is still autonomous. It might be extrinsic, but we're still in control of it. And that's a really, really important idea when we think about motivation. Unfortunately, and this is a personal opinion that I'm going to share with you, and I'm sure I can find some research to back it up, as I said earlier on. But this idea of controlled motivation and autonomous motivation is, and extrinsic and intrinsic motivation is really under threat. Sorry, not the idea is, but our intrinsic motivation is under threat from so many factors that exist in life. So for example, social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, we are often, when we're searching for those likes, we're often outsourcing our intrinsic motivation, right? I'm not climbing that mountain for my own good. I'm climbing it because I want to get those likes. And it's a really dangerous place, particularly for young people at the moment who are very, very sensitive to the drivers that are happening around them. And they are outsourcing previously intrinsic motives to the approval of their friends through how much engagement they get on their social media platforms. That's a really dangerous area. In fact, I think schools, there's a lot of things that happen in schools that undermine intrinsic motivation. And one of the obvious things is assessments. I used to be a psychology teacher, and I'd have children that would come to my classroom at the beginning of the year to study psychology, and they would come because they were so excited about learning about psychology. And by the time we'd hit them with a few really serious assessments, slowly but surely, their reasons for being there started to change. And I'd have children saying, "Sir, please, can I have a higher grade? Because if I don't get that higher grade, I'm not going to get into that university I need to get into." Their reasons for learning were no longer for that love of the subject. It was slowly to get that extrinsic piece. So this idea of extrinsic and intrinsic motivation is really, really, really important. So one of the key insights here, and this is a question that I'll ask you, is how can you internalize your behaviors? It's possible, let's say that you want to start moving your body a little bit and eating a little bit healthier and getting that's an obvious example that I'm going to use. You might have no intrinsic motivation for that, but it is possible for you to start at the bottom of that continuum and gradually move along that continuum to the point where it does start to become rewarding just for the sake of it. So a big question for you all is, how can you internalize your reasons for doing those activities? Because the moment you get to that fully internal place, where it's fully intrinsic, then all of a sudden you're doing it for those deeply rewarding and satisfying reasons.